In 1735, a British aristocrat convinced the entire Parliament of Great Britain to ban slavery in the American colonies, 30 years before the Revolution, a century before the Civil War. And almost nobody alive today has ever heard his name. Today, we're digging into James Oglethorpe, who he actually was, what his plan proposed, and why the search results we found suggest it may have directly lit the fuse on the American Revolution. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why this man was erased from the history books, what 40 acres and a mule really meant, and how one land reform plan threatened to upend the entire colonial economy. I've got someone here who has gone deep on this, and I want to start with the most basic question. How is it possible that someone this consequential is basically invisible in American history?
It's one of those things where the more you look at it, the more deliberate the erasure feels. The source material I went through describes Oglethorpe as someone whose biography you could browse on a wiki and come away thinking, okay, interesting colonial figure. But when you actually read what he did and what he was trying to do, it's a completely different story.
So let's start from the beginning. Who was this guy?
James Oglethorpe was a British royalist, educated at Eton and then Oxford, served as a member of Parliament, and was the holder of a royal land grant for what would become the state of Georgia. And here's the first thing most people don't know. He's the one who named Georgia. He named it after King George II, as a direct honor to the king who trusted him with the grant.
So he's literally the founder of Georgia, and people don't know his name.
Right. And his family background matters here too. His family had fought for King Charles I, suffered under Cromwell's dictatorship, and was only restored to service after the restoration of the monarchy. So Oglethorpe came from a lineage that had skin in the game when it came to questions of royal authority versus parliamentary power. That context shapes everything he did later.
Okay, so he's not just some random colonial administrator. He's got deep ideological roots.
Exactly. And here's where it gets genuinely wild. The source material I found describes Oglethorpe's first major colonial venture as recruiting 100 unemployed and, quote, unemployable people from London's poorhouses, loading them onto a ship and sailing to the New World, with himself at the helm as governor. The comparison used is that this was essentially the equivalent of Elon Musk loading up a starship with 100 random homeless people and lifting off for Mars.
Wait, he took London's poorest people and just went?
He went in 1733. And the thing is, the source material is very clear that this wasn't charity tourism. Oglethorpe was trying to prove something. He believed that London's so-called unemployables were only unemployable in London, that given land of their own and the support to work it, they would thrive. And according to what I found, he was right. The colony worked.
That's actually a remarkable hypothesis to test with your own life on the line.
It really is. And he didn't just drop them off and leave. He stayed, got the colony's affairs in order, established diplomatic relations with the Native Americans of the region, appointed leadership, and then sailed back to England, only to load up another group, including 40 Jewish settlers this time, and return to govern the colony personally until 1743.
So he made multiple crossings. This wasn't a one-time stunt.
Multiple crossings, and the source material points out that surviving a transatlantic crossing in that era was genuinely not guaranteed. This was a serious commitment. But what I think is the most underreported part of Oglethorpe's story is that he was an abolitionist before he ever set foot in the New World. That conviction shaped everything.
And there's a specific story in the sources about how that abolitionism showed up in practice, right? Something about a letter?
Yes, and this is one of those stories that just stops you cold. In 1732, while Oglethorpe was serving as an interim officer of the Royal Africa Company, a letter arrived on his desk. It had been written by an enslaved man named Diallo, written in Arabic, addressed to his father in Africa. The letter was so unusual that it had passed through multiple hands before reaching Oglethorpe, who sent it to Oxford to have the Arabic authenticated.
An enslaved man writing an eloquent letter in Arabic. That must have been genuinely shocking in that context.
The source material says it struck like a gong in Oglethorpe's mind, because here was clear proof that the people being sold into slavery as, quote, war captives were not the savages they were being presented as. Diallo was literate, articulate, and clearly understood the protocols of civil society. Oglethorpe concluded the Royal Africa Company was being lied to by those selling captives along Africa's coast.
So what did he do?
He purchased Diallo and freed him. The price, according to the source material, was £45 sterling, which in today's money would be approximately £5,300. And then he learned something that made the whole thing even more significant. Diallo was a Muslim who had been punished by his enslaver in Maryland for wanting to pray. That, the source says, cinched it for Oglethorpe. He brought Diallo to England as a, quote, star witness in his abolitionist plans.
That's an extraordinary move, using a real person's story as evidence in a political argument.
And the source material adds a layer of complexity here that I think is worth sitting with. Diallo himself had originally traveled to the West African coast to sell 2 slaves owned by his father, and was captured and enslaved in the process. The source is very clear that this doesn't mean Diallo deserved what happened to him. Nobody deserves to be enslaved, but it does complicate the simple narrative about who was enslaving whom.
Yeah, that's a genuinely uncomfortable piece of history to hold.
It is, and I think that's exactly why the source material includes it. Because Oglethorpe wasn't operating in a simple moral universe. He was navigating something genuinely messy and still coming down clearly on the side of human dignity. That's what makes him interesting. Okay, so we've established who Oglethorpe was. Abolitionist, colonial governor, someone willing to put his own resources and his own life behind his convictions. Now let's get into the plan itself, because this is where things get really consequential.
Right. So the Oglethorpe Plan, as it's described in the source material, was a land reform proposal for the American colonies. And it was elegant in its simplicity. Every new colonist would receive 50 acres of land, 5 acres in town, 45 acres in the country.
Why that specific split?
The 5 acres in town was about food security. The source material explains that 5 acres was enough for a family to grow their own food and become self-sufficient without needing to rely on anyone else. The 45 acres in the country was the economic engine. With draft animals, a family could work that land and become a direct participant in the agricultural economy. Not a laborer, an owner.
And here's where I want to pause, because there's something about the word acre itself that the source material unpacks, right?
Yeah, this is one of those tangents that actually illuminates the whole thing. An acre, historically, is the amount of land one man could till in a single day. That's where the unit comes from. So when you understand that, the phrase 40 acres and a mule suddenly has a very specific meaning. It's not just a symbolic gesture. It's a precise calculation of what a family needs to be economically independent. The mule is what makes the 45 country acres workable.
And most Americans think 40 acres and a mule was a post-Civil War promise to freed slaves.
That's the thing. According to the source material, that promise was originally made by Oglethorpe in his development plan for Georgia in the 1730s. General Ulysses S. Grant reintroduced the Oglethorpe plan during Reconstruction because, as the source puts it, it was brilliant. Grant added the mule. But the underlying idea, give people with nothing to work for something to work for, and they will get to work, that was Oglethorpe's.
That is a staggering piece of historical context that just doesn't show up in school.
It really doesn't, and the source material is pretty pointed about why. But before we get to the why, I want to make sure we understand what the plan actually threatened, because that's the key to understanding everything that followed.
Okay, walk me through it.
So here's the critical piece of context. In the colonial era, land ownership wasn't determined by lines on a map. It was determined by tillage, by what you could actually work. The source material is very explicit about this. Slavery was the only way a colonist could claim more land than he and his family could till themselves. Without slaves to work the land, the planters had no legitimate claim to their plantations.
So the entire plantation system was built on a legal fiction that only held up as long as there were enslaved people doing the work. Exactly. And Oglethorpe's plan attacked that from both directions at once. On one side, giving every family 5 acres in town made them food secure and independent. They didn't need to work for the planters. On the other side, giving every family 45 country acres made them direct competitors of the plantations in the agricultural market. The source material describes this as destroying an illicit market from both the supply and demand end simultaneously.
That's a genuinely sophisticated economic attack.
It is. And in 1735, Oglethorpe actually got the British Parliament to ban slavery in the American colonies. That's documented. And the source material argues that the moment that happened, the forces that would eventually produce the American Revolution were set in motion. Wait, so the argument is that the American Revolution wasn't primarily about taxation or representation, but about protecting the plantation economy?
That's the argument the source material makes, and it's a pretty bold one. The framing is that the planters, the wealthiest colonists whose land claims depended entirely on slave labor, needed to legitimize those claims and protect their labor supply. And to get ordinary colonists on board with open revolt against the crown, they needed a more palatable story. The source calls the idealistic framing of the revolution the, quote, excuses the planters sold their fellow colonists to incite them to open revolt.
That's a pretty provocative reread of one of the most celebrated events in American history. It is, and I want to be clear that the source material presents this as an argument, not a settled historical consensus. But the internal logic is hard to dismiss. If you accept that land claims required tillage, and tillage required enslaved labor, then abolishing slavery was an existential threat to the planter class, and the planter class had enormous political influence. The math works.
And where does King George fit into all of this? Because the standard story is that he's the villain. Right. And this is where the source material gets into territory that's genuinely counterintuitive. The argument is that Oglethorpe was acting as a proxy for King George II, specifically through his affiliation with the Most Noble Order of the Garter, which the source describes as essentially the Privy Council of Privy Councils, composed of the monarch, royal consort, royal heirs, and a limited number of principal nobility.
So the king was behind the abolitionist plan all along.
That's the claim. And the source material explains why the king worked through a proxy rather than taking credit directly. It comes back to Cromwell. George I, George II, and George III were all post-Cromwellian monarchs operating in a political environment where the parliament had real power and the crown had to be careful. Openly championing land reform and abolition would have been politically dangerous. So the work was done through Oglethorpe.
And the Continental Congress blamed King George for Parliament's sins.
According to the source material, yes, and deliberately so. The argument is that the true leaders of the revolution didn't want to stop Parliament as much as they wanted to stop the Oglethorpe plan. King George had to be the villain, because it was King George and the Order of the Garter who were working to undo the source of the planters' wealth.
That is a genuinely disorienting way to look at the founding of the United States.
It really is. And the source material doesn't claim to have definitive proof of all of it. It's explicit that some of this is reasoned argument rather than documented fact. But what is documented is that Oglethorpe got Parliament to ban slavery in the colonies in 1735, that his land reform plan was a real thing that threatened the planter class, and that he has been almost entirely erased from American historical memory.
Let's talk about that erasure for a second, because the source material also gets into how British history itself is written in a way that obscures some of this.
Yeah, this is a really interesting structural point. The source argues that British history since the Restoration has to be read as two parallel narratives, the Parliament story and the Crown's story, and that history books are written by parliamentarians. So acknowledging that it was Parliament which tolerated slavery while the Crown battled against it would be, in the source's words, tantamount to conceding the divine authority of the Crown. The British Parliament will not hear such arguments.
So the erasure is happening on both sides of the Atlantic, for different reasons.
Exactly. In Britain, acknowledging Oglethorpe's role would complicate the Parliament's self-image. In America, acknowledging it would complicate the founding mythology. The source puts it bluntly, history books are not written by the victors, they're written by the parliamentarians.
And then there's the Grant connection, which I think deserves a bit more attention, because the source material makes a really specific claim about Reconstruction.
Right. So, after the Civil War, General Grant reintroduced what the source calls the Oglethorpe Plan during Reconstruction. The promise of 40 acres, and Grant added the mule, was directed at freed slaves. But the source argues this was opposed by the planter class during the 19th century for exactly the same reasons Oglethorpe and the Order of the Garter were opposed in the 18th century. The economic threat was identical.
Same plan, same opposition, 100 years later.
And the source makes a pointed observation about Grant's implementation. He chose to apply land reforms west of the Mississippi rather than forcing them east of the Mississippi because, the source asks, who could possibly oppose land grants beyond the pale of civilization? The answer, of course, was Native Americans. And the source notes that if Native Americans had had accurate maps, history might have been kinder to them.
That's a haunting line.
It really is. And it connects to something the source material touches on about the Crown's relationship with Native American leaders, which is also counterintuitive. The source argues that while American colonists were, quote, confusing their fellow man for savages at best and animals at worst, the British monarch was entertaining Native American leaders in diplomatic negotiations at Kensington Palace. One does not negotiate with savages or animals.
So the Crown was actually more progressive on Native American sovereignty than the colonists were.
That's the argument. And Oglethorpe himself was personally involved in conveying diplomatic missions between Native American leaders from the Carolinas and Georgia to negotiate treaties, not with representatives of the Crown, but with the King himself at Kensington Palace. The source is very clear that this was not a minor diplomatic courtesy. This was substantive engagement.
Okay, I want to zoom out for a second because I think there's a bigger pattern here that the source material is pointing at. This isn't just about one man and one plan.
Right. The source situates Oglethorpe within a much larger argument about what happens when powerful economic interests collide with moral reform movements. The pattern the source identifies is that every time a genuinely progressive idea threatens an entrenched economic system, the economic interests find ways to bury it, sometimes through violence, sometimes through historical revision, sometimes through both. And the Oglethorpe story is one of the clearest examples of that pattern. It's almost a textbook case. A man with genuine moral conviction, institutional backing, and a workable plan gets close enough to success that the people who stand to lose everything mobilize against him. And then history is written in a way that makes him disappear. The source describes Oglethorpe as the originally uppity Brit, and uses that word very deliberately.
What's the source's diagnosis of why this keeps happening?
The source frames it as a failure of what it calls peer review, not just in science, but in the broader intellectual culture. The argument is that when people become more devoted to their hypotheses, their economic interests, their existing beliefs, than to manifest truth, you get a kind of intellectual idolatry. And that idolatry is what allows bad ideas to persist and good ones to get buried.
That's actually a pretty useful frame for thinking about a lot of things beyond just this historical moment.
It is. And the source is careful to say this applies to everyone. Theologians who are more devoted to their interpretations of scripture than to manifest truth. Scientists who are more devoted to their hypotheses than to manifest truth. The source says we are all susceptible to this because we define ourselves too much by what we believe. Accepting that is the most difficult challenge for any free-thinking individual.
So when you step back from everything we've covered today, Oglethorpe's background, the plan, the 1735 abolition, the land reform, the connection to 40 acres and a mule, the erasure, what's the through line?
Here's what this really comes down to. James Oglethorpe was not a footnote. He was a man who, in the 1730s, assembled a workable plan to abolish slavery, redistribute land equitably, and make every colonial family economically independent. He got Parliament to act on it, and the backlash to that plan, according to the source material, is what produced the American Revolution.
And the reason we don't know this is because the people who won the revolution wrote the history.
Or more precisely, the parliamentarians wrote the history on both sides of the Atlantic. The source is very specific about that distinction. It's not that the victors wrote history, it's that the institutional interests with the most to lose from Oglethorpe's legacy being remembered accurately are the same institutional interests that have always controlled the historical record.
And the Grant connection makes it even more striking because the same plan gets tried again a century later and gets buried again for the same reasons.
That's the part that I keep coming back to. It's not just that Oglethorpe was erased. It's that the idea itself, give people with nothing to work for something to work for, and they will get to work, keeps getting rediscovered and keeps getting suppressed. Grant found it, and the planter class of the 19th century opposed it for exactly the same reasons the planter class of the 18th century opposed it.
There's something almost tragic about that.
It is tragic. And the source material ends on a note that I think is worth sitting with. It says that Oglethorpe's plan was to turn the American colonies into what it calls the Shire, a place where every family was a landowner, every person was self-sufficient, and the community was built on genuine equity. The planters in subsequent generations called their version Dixie. Those two visions of America went to war with each other, and we're still living with the consequences.
That is a genuinely powerful way to frame the Civil War.
And it reframes the revolution too. If the source material is right, the American Revolution wasn't just a fight for liberty, it was a fight over whose vision of America would survive. Oglethorpe's vision lost in 1776. Grant tried to revive it in 1865. And the question of whether it ever actually got implemented is still very much open.
So here's what I want to leave listeners with. We started this episode with a man nobody has heard of who tried to abolish slavery in America in 1735. And what we found is that his obscurity is not an accident. It's the outcome of the very forces he was fighting against.
And the actionable insight here, I think, is this. The next time you encounter a piece of history that seems too convenient, a founding myth that's a little too clean, a villain who's a little too obvious, a promise that everyone remembers wrong, it's worth asking who benefits from that version of the story. Because Oglethorpe's story shows us that the gap between what happened and what gets remembered is never random.
And the fact that 40 acres and a mule is remembered as a post-Civil War promise rather than a 1730s land reform plan is maybe the most concrete example of that gap we've ever discussed on this show.
It really is. And I'll add one more thing. The source material makes the point that Oglethorpe's plan was not just morally right, it was economically brilliant. Making everyone a landowner collapses the market for slave labor from both ends. It's not just idealism, it's strategy. And that's probably why it was so threatening.
We started this episode with a man who bought another man's freedom for 45 pounds sterling and sailed across the Atlantic with London's poorest people to prove that human dignity was not a theory. And what we found is that he came closer to changing the course of American history than almost anyone we were taught to celebrate. The question the source material leaves us with is a simple one. What else has been quietly buried? And who is still benefiting from the burial?